everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Serena. I'm a manager at Books Are Magic, and I just want to start by thanking you all so much for joining us tonight, including those tuning in virtually, as we celebrate the release of Doma Mahmoud's Cairo Circles, which he will be reading from and discussing tonight alongside Amir, Ahmadi, Arian. And I have the pleasure of introducing them this evening, but before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. So firstly, in consideration of everyone's safety, we ask that you please keep your masks on for the full duration of this event, including in the signing line. The signing line will be taking place at the desk near the door that you entered. You should have received your copy of Cairo Circles upon entry, but if you would like to purchase additional copies to be signed, please do so at that back register over there. To those tuning in from our YouTube live stream, you can purchase your copy of the book as well as Amir's book via the link in the description, or simply type booksaremagic.net/Cairo-circles and it will take you to the right place. Lastly, there will be a time for your audience questions later, and we will be conducting a hand-raised Q&A, so make sure to prepare your questions for that time. Now, a bit about the book for context. Cairo Circles orbits around the interconnected lives of two Egyptian families, illuminating their bonds and divisions through the experiences of the 6 children, including Shiro and Tamor, who are best friends, Amir, who is Shiro's cousin, and Omar, Mustafa, and Zaina, the children of Tamor's family maid. As their stories unfold over the course of several decades, we see as each character navigates cultural expectations, socioeconomic obstacles, and psychological hurdles. What results is a dynamic and epic debut that has been called a, quote, new book you'll love by BuzzFeed, an anticipated new release by the millions, and selected for the October Indie Next list by booksellers across the U.S. Doma Mahmoud has an MFA in creative writing from New York University. He currently teaches at the American University of Cairo and is based in Cairo, Egypt. Cairo Circles is his first book. As mentioned, joining Doma in conversation this evening is Amir Ahmadi Arian, who earned his MFA in the NYU Creative Writing Program as the Axon Foundation /EL Doctoral Fellowship recipient. He now teaches literature and creative writing at CUNY City College and Baruch College, New York. He has published short stories and essays in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, Paris Review, LRB, LitHub, Massachusetts Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. His first novel in English, Then the Fish Swallowed Him, was published by HarperCollins in March 2020. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Doma and Amir.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming out this evening, and hello.
Hey.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for coming out, guys.
It's been a while. When was it? 3 years ago, I think.
3 years ago, yeah, we graduated.
Good to see you again. Thought we can probably start by a little reading from the book. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Your own.
So I'll just read a few pages from the very beginning of the book, so you guys can read along if you would like. Yeah, just the very beginning, and then I'll read. Can you guys hear me okay? Everyone can hear me? Thank you guys for coming. It's just a bunch of people I love in the audience. Cool. For almost 15 years now, Zaina's mother, Selma, had served as housemaid for none other than Madame Alia Abazo, a former actress who starred in a handful of comedies back before Zaina was born, in the mid-80s. In Madame Alia's penthouse, there was a small room, originally built as a storage space, reserved for Selma and Zaina. Tonight, Zaina would be locked inside, for it was New Year's Eve and guests would soon arrive for the Madame's traditional gathering. "All right," Selma said. "Are you sure you don't need the bathroom?" "Just go, Momo. I'll be checking on you in case you do. You need anything else?" Zaina didn't respond. She was lying down on the mattress that occupied half the room, facing the wall, with her knees tucked into her chest and her long brown hair covering the side of her face. She was 11 and a half years old, but her mother still couldn't trust her to stay in the room. Zena understood that it was a consequence of her frequent misbehavior, but it was humiliating to be locked inside such a small space like a rabid dog. Zena, Selma said, I asked you a question. It's like I'm an animal. Oh, come on, Selma said. I've told you so many times, I have to. Why? Did Madame Alia tell you to? No, Selma said. It's for me, for my peace of mind. So I'm not constantly worried that you'll walk out into the party. It offended Zena that her presence at the Madame's gathering would be considered so scandalous. What, is President Mubarak coming? See? That's the void inside your head I don't trust. Khalas, Zena said. Just go. Zena kept facing the wall and making her disappointment known. She was putting her mother in danger of being yelled at, since Selma ought to be preparing for the guests outside. But it was Zena's right to be upset, not because she would spend hours in the room, but because it was New Year's Eve and she would have to sit there alone while her brothers celebrated with friends back home. Despite being 2 years younger, Mustafa and Omar were free to roam the streets under no supervision simply because they weren't girls. Selma reached for Zena's CD player. Look, she said, this Walkman is getting old, and I'm sure Madame Alia will realize soon. Zena turned around and looked at her. You mean a new Walkman? For me? It's not a promise, Selma said, but it's likely. She mentioned it a few days ago. Zena held her mother's arm. Well, what did she say? It's best to keep it as a surprise, Selma said. You don't want to hope for something, then not get it. It was early in Zena's life when Madame Alia made it known that Zena's musical talent was remarkable. Zena would be sitting in the room or kitchen, singing along to the tracks playing on Madame Alia's record player, and then the Madame would come across her and clap excitedly, as if she had just stumbled upon a bag of gold. Eventually, she bought Zena a Walkman, which still worked to this day, and had gifted her album after album ever since. Today, Zena had dozens of songs memorized. She held her Walkman close to her chest. But I still get to keep this one. Of course, Salma said. Yalla, now I really have to go. And I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
Okay. So, got a bunch of questions for you. Let's just start from the beginning. I remember reading bits of this book back in 2016. So it's been in the making at least for 5 years. I assume, even before that.
Yeah.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about, like the journey of this book from the inception to today.
Cool. Yeah. So I have to start with a little anecdote. So I started this book with Zena and her family and Mustafa and Omar. And the book basically follows Zena, her mom, her 2 brothers back home, and then also Madame Alia and her son Taimur, and then his friend Shiro. But Shiro's part of the story I started maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and Shiro's story followed, at the beginning of the book, his cousin commits this violent act. He's been radicalized, and I remember being in class and trying to come up with a with a name for the character, and I wanted him to have this name that signified, like the fact that he feels this sense of self-importance. And Amir was sitting close by, and I thought about Amir and how it means prince in Arabic, and I was like, that's it. His name's Amir. So now the character in the book that gets radicalized.
Very flattered.
Yeah. But yeah, very long journey. I started as an undergrad actually on this book. I think the first couple of years I was learning how to write through the characters, which took, I think, took a lot of failing and rewriting and failing and rewriting. And then we did the MFA together, and MFA was great because you have a bunch of people reading your stuff and working on it with you and giving you feedback. And then I got in touch with Sarah Levitt, who's my agent, who's back there, and she was a great support and pushing me in those last couple of years to get it to a point where we could send it out to publishers, and here we are.
Cool. Yeah. So this book, it's not that long, but just so much is happening here on so many levels. And it's, it's kind of, there are multiple themes kind of running in parallel. So I want to touch on a couple of them. One of them, I noticed is basically is, on one level is a family drama, right? So you've got two main families, and there are other little families kind of orbiting around them. And yeah, it's almost, at some points reads like I don't know, like a 19th century French, family novel. Yeah, I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. How did you kind of come to the idea of writing, like from the or focusing on family as like, kind of the main sort of narrative unit?
Yeah, so I mean, I think from the very beginning, I was interested in like this, social class dynamics in Cairo, and I've always thought about how families can be separated by social class so intensely, but they're also very interlinked and they interact on a daily basis, right? So I wanted from the beginning to follow three different families from different social classes who are very much involved in each other's lives. So Madame Alia's family is very upper class, traditionally has inherited all this wealth, and then Selma, her housekeeper, is obviously from the lower class, and Selma essentially ends up raising Taimur, Madame Alia's son. So yeah, and I think it ended up being a family drama because of that. I think also, writing about Egypt, there are certain political questions you have to avoid. So you want to stay with the personal, and there's nothing more personal than family dynamics, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, writing, in Egypt or really anywhere in the Middle East, there are political questions you have to avoid, but there are political questions you have to address.
Yes.
There are things you can't avoid. And one of them that I was thinking, kind of coming from Iran, very similar experience, is that how these kind of moments of political intensity, political turmoil, basically split families, right? So there's the society comes on the brink of a revolution, and politically is very charged. And in those moments, like the son becomes a communist, I don't know, dad becomes a fundamentalist, mom becomes spiritual, and they kind of go down these really kind of diverging paths until the family falls apart. This happens here in this book too. I mean, it happens in reality a lot, especially in those parts of the world. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that happened in 2011 in Egypt, and in the few years that followed, there was these kind of narratives that were very, splitting the country by half, and they split families also by half, and siblings had very differing opinions. I think in America they've started seeing some of that happening also. Not as much of that in the book, but I think, one of the things also that I've always been fascinated with is the idea of two or three characters being very close as children and being part of the same family, and then growing up and becoming really almost like radically different people, and the tension that comes from that, right? When you've known someone for 20 years and you have all this history with them and you love them sincerely, but you also can't stand them, and you think, they're, you disagree on everything basically. And I think that happens in the book within these families, right? You have brothers who become very different, cousins who become very different.
Yeah. So there's another question I had. This is also another thing I've been dealing with, or probably anyone who writes in from those contexts, which is that you have characters who speak a language that is different from the language of your writing language, right? So you write in English, but you're writing about characters who speak in Arabic. I mean, supposedly. So then you kind of play with that a little bit, kind of try to address that. There are quite a few Arabic words here and there throughout the book. There are Arabic phrases in Arabic, and also you play with like font a little bit. There's some phrases that are bold there. So yeah, or in general, just out of maybe my own curiosity, how do you deal with that challenge?
Yeah, so I mean, you translate novels, you probably know this, but in translating dialogue, I think there's kind of two main directions that people can take. You can try to translate it literally, right? So, for example, the term "يخرب بيتك" in Arabic means, damn your house, which if you translate literally doesn't really, I mean, it can work in a certain context, but then there's the other sort of translation where you try to translate it to the equivalent, to the English equivalent, right? And I think I tried to go with the latter direction. And yeah, one thing I tried to play around with also, I mean, there are people in this room who know exactly what I'm talking about, but in terms of class dynamics and people being from the upper class and getting a completely different education, one thing that happens often in Egypt is that people will walk into a room and they'll speak English so that they can afford themselves a sense of privacy and sometimes even speak about other people in the room in English and they don't understand them, and then they come to America and they'll start speaking Arabic so that no one understands them. So there are a few chapters or scenes in the book where that's happening. There's a couple of characters speaking in English and the person whose point of view we are in doesn't understand what's being said, even though sometimes they're being spoken about. So yeah, try to play around with that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to talk about characters a little bit. You have a pretty massive cast of characters. I don't know how many. I didn't count. Do you know how many characters?
6.
No, but
The whole book, something like 20.
Yeah. And a lot of them are pretty major. Like the book doesn't have like a protagonist, right? It's kind of divided among 6 characters. So yeah, probably my favorite character in this book is Shiro, because of what happens to him, basically, right? This is someone who hasn't done anything wrong, but just by association, his life is being destroyed, right? Almost, gradually over time. And, just because he's the cousin of the person who carried out that, terrorist attack in the subway, little by, and he lives in America, so little by little, he's kind of being corralled and, embattled by all kinds of forces in the society, and eventually he has an outburst that then puts him on a
without giving
path
a
of no return.
Yeah, there you go.
So but the idea, and it's also a very familiar kind of character, the feeling of guilt by association. You haven't done anything yourself, but because you are kind of linked to somebody who has done a horrific thing, and just from outside you're all being kind of lumped in together at just one whole. So if one person in that community does something, everybody else has to kind of bear the guilt. So talk to us a little bit about Shiro.
So Shiro is the only character in the book who the novel follows in first person. Everyone else is in third person, and he's a character who's kind of at a crossroads between a lot of different things. First of all, he comes from more of a middle class background, but grows up amongst people from the upper class, so he feels that tension of like, do I belong with these people? Second of all, he also comes to America and gets kind of Americanized, right, and gets seduced by the lifestyle that he lives here and the freedoms that he's afforded. At the same time, he comes from an Egyptian background that's also pretty conservative, so he's torn between those two things too. And lastly, he's also torn between not just the American lifestyle, but American way of being that's very individualistic, right? It's all about making it. It's all about taking care of yourself, your career, etc., etc. But once again, he comes from this big family where you're meant to take care of your cousins and siblings and ask about them and show up for them. So he feels a lot of guilt about that already. And then this, at the beginning of the novel, this event happens and he feels a lot of guilt because he feels like a character of Amir, who he was once very close to and was close to for 15 years growing up, has kind of gone off the rails, and he feels slightly responsible for that. And I think that what I tried to ask with this novel and with this character is, what should we embrace from these different cultures, from these different classes, and how can one navigate being at these crossroads? Because I think it's a common experience now, especially with like globalization and people migrating and all that. I think he also is a character who, you know, has these different modes of being. Like he's at home and he's like, you know, in the Egyptian mode of being, and he's speaking a certain way. But then he shows up to New York, and you know, he's in another completely another mode of being. And yeah, so that's Shiro.
Yeah, the class. I mean, you mentioned class a few times here, but it was interesting to me that when it comes to class specifically, it's a pretty bleak book. It's kind of dark.
Thank you. That's a compliment.
No, in the sense that there's basically no class mobility that I can think of. So if you're kind of born into a certain class in the society, you're stuck there basically for your whole life either way. And yeah, so I said it kind of reminded me of 19th century novels in terms of family. But now that I'm thinking more about it, it reminds me of Zola a little bit in that regard, in the sense that how the characters' sort of surroundings and context determines their fate, right? And so you work, you kind of work on that. You write about that as well. So it's a class dynamic that's, maybe a little, well, probably now is more familiar to the American society, but it was not supposed to be like that, or that's not like the, like the kind of the utopia people are led to believe. Yeah, talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say. I mean, I think in terms of the class mobility, I think Egypt, especially towards the end of the 20th century, there is the opportunity to make the money, right? But I think the anxiety that a lot of the characters have is this suspicion that even if you make the money, you're still coming from wherever you're coming from, right? You're still from this class or that class, right? And that because you have a certain last name, that's just who you are, and that's who you will be forever. And yeah, there's a couple of characters who struggle with that idea. I think essentially, this book is at least half of the six main characters are characters who are, who struggle with these class dynamics. Either they're really, restless to move up the ladder and to be someone that they're not, or they're restless to maintain their position on the social ladder, or they just can't stand the existence of the social ladder in the first place because it's really intense. And I tried to really get into that in the book, right? Really showcase how intense these class dynamics can be and how segregative they can be.
Yeah, you kind of touch on colonialism, but you don't delve into it. And the moments that kind of colonialism comes up is in connection to the class, right?
Yes.
Or did I read it right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So is this like a product of colonialism, or it was like that?
I mean, I'm a product of colonialism. I'm like out here writing a book about Egypt in English, right? So, no, it's true.
Yeah.
And I think that's also something I didn't try to go, too deep into that, but it's something I tried to touch on, which is that, these characters, when they walk into a room and they're able to just speak English, and there's almost an impression that you give in Egypt if you're like fluent in English, right? That you're almost like educated and respected. And that's obviously a product of colonialism. I mean, I think especially the upper class in Egypt, they definitely want to be like the Europeans. I think we can all agree on that, at least the Egyptians in this room, right? We speak languages that aren't Arabic. We look down on our culture in a lot of different ways, right? And I think that is a consequence of the colonial history in Egypt.
Yeah, it sounds all too familiar.
Yeah.
All right, so we talked about Shiro. Another character that I found it very interesting how you characterize Zena here, because the book starts with her. And she has very strong presence in the first chapter of the book and the first kind of maybe third of the book.
So let's not give away that spoiler. But
Okay,
I can
that's
speak.
right.
He was about to give you guys a major spoiler. But I'll speak about the character of Zena. So Zena.
I will ask my question.
Okay, go ahead.
So, Actually, you're right. I can't ask that question without.
Yeah, I saw it coming.
Okay.
So Zaina is a character, as you guys just saw, who is in very close contact with this upper class family. She's forced to go to this apartment in Zamalek, which is traditionally an upper class neighborhood in Cairo. And, you know, her father has decided that she doesn't need to go to school because she's just fated to, you know, grow up and get married and work as a housekeeper or whatever job. And so she can't read or write, and she's in this apartment all the time, and she sees this insane amount of wealth that obviously her family doesn't have, wealth and privilege. And for some reason or another, for better or worse, she feels entitled to it. She's like, I'm gonna get this. I'm gonna get this. This is gonna be mine. And she's a great singer, and this is something that's confirmed to her by, you know, several characters in the book who are kind of figures of authority on the matter. And she just, from a young age, has this like, you know, tunnel vision focus of like, this is my way into getting these nice things that these people have. And then obviously it doesn't quite work out that way. But yeah, I think, you know, that's some background on Zena.
It's not a spoiler to say she kind of drops out of the story.
No, that's not too much of a spoiler, but we can stop there.
Okay. All right. So, and then you've got the character of Amir, who he was so, you know, generously named after me, who carries out a terrorist attack, by the way. And yeah, so there's been, you know, since 9/11, obviously, you know, wherever you look, there's a book about radicalization of kind of young Muslim men. And yeah, a lot of them kind of follow, you know, talk about a similar journey. This was a kid, you know, like anyone else. In this case, also, this Amir grew up, I don't know, doing what everybody else was doing, and like loved watching football, soccer, and you know, reading Batman, and all the stuff like that. Then, you know, something changed along the way, and we ended up with, you know, he becomes who he is. So yeah, this is it has also almost become a trope, right?
Yes,
when you read about you know, novels or fiction around fundamentalism. So I'm sure you were aware of that too.
Of course.
When writing this book. So how did you try to kind of I don't know, take a different path or introduce a different character from what we have kind of used to read about?
Yeah, so I think I went into it with the intention of taking this trope and trying to do something different with it. You know, I mean, through the years we've seen, and I think it's a racial thing, right? We've seen the lone wolf white school shooter who's been, you know, documentaries about them, movies about them, books about them, and it's an act of, you know, understanding these people who go on to do these horrible things, and even beyond, like a show like Narcos, right? Which is technically, you know, a show about narco-terrorists, right? And then when I was watching it, I remember watching that scene when Pablo Escobar's cousin got killed, and I like was crying and stuff. And I think it's a positive thing to try to understand people who do horrible things and to try to empathize with them and remember that they're human beings. And I felt like that hadn't been done enough with the violent Muslim character that had gotten radicalized. You know, the trope is just usually this like long bearded man on the screen yelling profanities and then blowing himself up, and that's it, right? Nothing else is offered. There's no nuance to it. There's no humanity behind it. And so I went into it with the intention of doing something different with it and bringing some of that nuance and making a statement of like, hey, these criminals are also people who are born as completely innocent human beings, and they become radicalized, right? And the radicalization is something that happens to them. It's not something that they go into it with intention. But definitely there was a lot of hesitation on my part, you know, and actually to share another anecdote, in one of our workshops, I believe you were in that workshop. You were, yes. There was another Arab writer in the class who kind of got mad at me for writing Muslim character who had been radicalized, you know, and after my workshop, he sent me this long email of like, basically like, how could you do this, you know? Hasn't this been done enough? And my point was like, well, the point is that I'm trying to do it differently, right? Did I succeed? I don't know, you guys can tell me. But I tried, and I think also, you know, one thing this classmate and I, we ended up having this long email exchange, and I basically tried to tell her like, hey, like, you know, I understand that we're writers of color and that we're not as included in this industry, but it's not our responsibility to like write about our people in this like positive way of like, look how amazing we are, right?
So who wants to read that?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. But there was definitely a lot of hesitation, but ultimately I decided to give it a shot.
Mm. Okay, so no, what time is it? Tell me.
7:34.
34. Okay.
So it's
So yeah, I have just a couple of notes on the structure. We can then wrap it up and
yeah.
take questions. So yeah, I got two images in terms of structure. It's a very interesting novel in terms of how it's structured. It's I think it's almost experimental in its form, and it doesn't have a pivot like a pivotal character or pivotal storyline. There are like multiple. It's almost fragmented. There's like a story fragmented across several families, two countries and two different social classes. And so yeah, I was really reading this, really interested in how you kind of bring this all together. So two images came to my mind. One of them was that I kind of saw every character as like a dot on a map, right? So there's, as I said, no pivotal character. Every character has pretty much the same share of space, same about number of pages. It may be even in the book, and every character is kind of connected to other characters with some links. Some of them pretty tenuous, some of them pretty strong. Some of them are familiar, some of them are like by a couple of mediations, right? So overall, what we have is a web, basically, right? We have a web of characters. We don't have whatever the other thing is, so I think that's very risky for a novelist to write like that, to give characters kind of equal weight in a narrative and avoid creating a protagonist that everybody circles around. That was one image that I had. Then the other image I had came from the title of the book, which is Cairo Circles. And I think it's a very smart choice of title. For one, the novel is actually circular. Like it reads like a bunch of spirals almost that kind of descend into the abyss for all of these families. And so there's that. So you kind of take us on a like circular journeys from one family to the other. Then you have the idea of kind of gathering here is very important, like family gatherings. The novel opens up with Madame Alia's party, and then you've got all other gatherings in different families along the way. A lot of the book is actually set in houses where kind of people have come together as some sort of a party. So that also is a kind of a circle, right? I don't know. I have these two images. It's not really a question, but if we can kind of talk to that, talk to how you structure the narrative here.
Yeah, I mean, so, with regard to gatherings, I think, at least for the Egyptians in the room, in Egypt, you wake up every day and the question you ask yourself is like, who am I going to gather with today? Right? We don't live solitary lives at all. And so definitely a lot of the scenes of the book are gatherings. I think, I've always enjoyed fiction and film that has that, whole structure of a web of characters. And I especially enjoy when a story, follows a web of characters and at the beginning they're separated and then later on they come together. So that's what I tried to do with Cairo Circles. I wanted kind of to give this zoomed out portrait of these class dynamics in Cairo. And I actually used to think of it in terms of a map, right? So there's Zamalek in the middle of the Nile as an island, and this is like the upper class neighborhood, and across the Nile is the slum where Salma and her children are from, and then out west in the area of Haram is this character Shiro and his family, and yeah, it's definitely a web, and I think, you know, yeah. So I went into it with the intent. I wanted to do that from the beginning, and then there was the trick of trying to figure out how to structure it, which was really difficult. I think, you know, for example, one decision was like how much weight do I give each character? How do I balance each character? When do I jump from one character to another? Again, took a lot of experimentation, a lot of failure, a lot of work with Sarah, and yeah, I wanted, you know, and also in terms of it's not linear, as you said, it's circular. It jumps back and forth and back and forth. So it was definitely experimental, and I think there are a few consequences of making that choice that came out that aren't exactly great. You know, I think one of them, for example, is that for most people that read this book, there's a couple of characters that they enjoy reading more than others, right? And I think sometimes the reader gets a bit frustrated when they have to leave the character they love to hear about this one that they don't love as much. But my promise or my hope is that it pays off at the end, and that you feel like, you know, it was worth doing it that way. And yeah.
Interesting. It's you know, because, you know, as a novelist, probably time is the most important thing for you. But you write kind of novel as almost like a, you know, cartographer. It's a very spatial book, and yet that when you're talking about it in terms of maps, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, it has the structure of a map. Okay, so it's
7:40.
7:40. Time for questions. So you guys just raise your hands and yeah.
All right, so I kind of wanted to ask you, you know, when first reading the novel, I think that I kind of trying to think of like, where does Adham fit into the novel? 'Cause obviously there's like a lot of self-reflection and self-insertion whenever somebody writes usually. And the character of Shiru and his experience, Shiru and coming from Egypt and going to New York, how much of that is like self-reflective, and also like how much of that is commentary on Western culture and New York culture, and kind of like how somebody adapts to that, and how much do you say about that as compared to Egyptian culture and things like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of how much of it is autobiographical, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. No, but, you know, I think, obviously, you know, it's a lot of fun, especially for people that know the author, to get into it and try to see how much of it is my life. And I think it's fun for me to not tell you and for you to figure it out yourself. But I think in terms of, you know, the question of coming to America and having to reconcile this American lifestyle and culture with the Egyptian roots definitely was a very personal thing that I tried to instill in the character of Shiro. Because I think it's a very particular experience, but also an experience that you've also had, right? And that a lot of us in this room have had. And I wanted to write about it. I wanted to write about that struggle of finding your own identity and finding your own sense of peace, really, between these two forces and cultures that are super different and at an odds with each other, really. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Kind of? Yes? Great.
So I had kind of a structural question. I've yet to read the book, but from what Amir was describing is that you start off in first person from Shiro's perspective, I presume from the beginning of the book, and then you kind of expand into the rest of your characters. I was interested to know. So obviously Shiro might have been the starting point for when you were crafting the idea, but was it clear to you that there was going to be a point when they spread off and you start to take on these individual characters' lives and put a big magnifying lens on them? Creating that map, I'm interested in how you created that map of those characters after in that transition point.
So I actually started with the third-person characters, with Zena specifically, and I knew, you know, writing the first chapter, these 2 pages that I read to you guys are the first 2 pages I ever wrote, and I wrote them like 5 years ago. And I knew that the next chapter was going to be Mustafa, her brother, at school. So that was the intention from the very beginning, and actually the trick was now wanting to write this character of Shiro in the first person. I wanted to mess around with first person, and I wanted to kind of capture his first person voice and how to fit him into this web of characters who are followed in the third person. Essentially, at some point, I decided that I would just alternate every, it was a third person chapter, then Shiro's chapter, then a third person chapter, then Shiro's chapter. So it's a novel that follows 6 characters, but I think, at least half of it is in Shiro's perspective. So you could also say that it's kind of a novel about him too. And yeah, thank you.
What were some books or films that were like key inspirations while you were writing the book that were formative for you?
Thank you. That's a great question. So in terms of writing a book that kind of provides this portrait of one element of the city that is Cairo, Naguib Mahfouz was definitely a big inspiration. His Cairo trilogy specifically. I read that and I came out of it with the impression that I know Cairo in a different way now, especially in mid 20th century Cairo, and I wanted to do that with this book. So he was definitely an inspiration. But then in terms of plot and in terms of following 6 different characters and being experimental in my structure, I think a lot of foreign movies, really, a lot of Almodovar's movies, a lot of City of God was my favorite movie for years. Watched it a million times. The other one, Tropa d'Elite, has anyone watched that one? It's, also jumps back and forth and follows these different characters and eventually they meet. I just find stories like that a lot of fun to read and to watch, and that's what I try to do with Cairo Circles, yeah. Thank you.
In the process of writing the book, how did the audience affect your writing? So the idea that you're obviously writing this in New York about Egypt. I know the book's coming out in Egypt. How was that? Is that something that you were conscious of? Is this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things I also had to figure out, right, that's a great question. When I was writing it, a lot of time I'd pause and I'd be like, who am I writing this for? Is it Egyptians or is it Americans? Right? And at some point I decided it's whoever enjoys the book, right? I had to decide that essentially I was writing the book that I would enjoy reading, and that whoever would come along and enjoy it, great, and then whoever wouldn't, too bad, right? Because I think, I found that if I decided, I'm writing this for Egyptians, or upper class Egyptians, or I'm writing this exclusively for Americans or whatever, that was going to be very self-limiting, and boring, really. So, yeah, it's a cheesy question, but I think really at some point I decided I'm just writing this the way that I would enjoy reading it, and whoever connects with it will connect with it.
Are you thinking of translating it?
So I would love to, obviously, I would reach a wider audience in Arabic, in Egypt, but I think definitely there are a number of scenes in this book that would have to get, changed a significant amount just because of, censorship issues and where Egypt's at right now in terms of what we publish in Arabic. And I think that's possible and that's okay, and I could try to, figure out how to do that, but I think I would really have to find the right publisher and right translator to do that with, and without taking away from the integrity of the novel. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you guys for coming. Thank you very much. I have to get a picture of the audience, please. Everyone, maybe we can put up our books. Everyone I love. Yay! 3, 2, 1. Amazing. Thank you guys.
I want to, not a question, but can you do another reading, like one of your other...
Sure, maybe we can wrap up. I'll wrap up with a couple of pages from Shiro's first person perspective. It's my sister looking out for me there. I want more.
I want more.
Okay, so let me give you the page number. So this is page 113. So this is, a few chapters into the book. Shiro has arrived in Cairo after his cousin has done this insane thing, essentially, and he's in the process of figuring out what's happening. And yeah, so Outside Cairo International Airport, 4 taxi drivers approached me and began with "Welcome, welcome home," and "The city has lit up," and "What a sweet face you've brought us," before they offered to carry my suitcase and argued among one another about who would take me home. I rebelled against their unsophisticated system and demanded to ride with the oldest man who was losing ground in the dispute. I figured he would be the most likely to let me sit in silence until I arrived home, but as we waited in line to exit the parking lot, he asked me where I had returned from, and it turned out he had numerous opinions to share about America. "It's all their fault," he said. "They burnt Iraq to ashes, thinking that they could spill that much blood and get away with it. But that's not how the world works, is it? They're lucky they haven't had more attacks. Do you know, my son, what it means to have a foreign man come into your land, kill your neighbors and relatives, and imprison you in your own jails? They will suffer the consequences for decades. It's good you came back to your country." I performed a smile. There's a lot of kind people there, you know, and to attack innocent civilians is just wrong. He looked offended. "Of course it's wrong. Do you not know the chapter of the Quran, the disbelievers?" "I do," I said, hoping he wouldn't recite it. "In the name of God, most merciful, most compassionate. Say, disbelievers, I do not worship what you worship. I will never worship what you worship. You will never worship what I worship. You have your religion, and I have mine." "I mean," I said, "let there be no compulsion in religion. Attack only when attacked." "Yes." "Of course it's wrong," the man said again. "These same terrorists kill their own Muslim brothers in Iraq. On the day of days, they will meet God, who will hand them the worst punishment." "Right. But so would the Americans," I said. On a regular day, I would have spent the rest of the journey trying to explain to the driver, regardless of how stubborn he was, that there were millions of Americans who accepted and loved Muslims as their fellow citizens, and that their main intention was to get by, not to wage war against Islam. I would have emphasized that for every million men who believed that America was at war with Islam, one man would be successfully convinced to sacrifice his life for that war. But now my own cousin had become that man, that fool, and I didn't have the will to argue with the driver. I lit a cigarette as we made it out of the airport and onto Salah Salim Street. On the surface, Cairo was a shock to the unaccustomed eye. Buildings originally painted in different colors were covered with so much dust that they had evolved into similar shades of grim. Drivers swerved in and out of lanes with no regard to order, honking every few seconds for no reason, as if to contribute to the mandatory beep 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 that never ceased. Vendors whipped at the legs of malnourished horses so their cars could be dragged faster. Stray dogs and cats scavenged for food around the piles of trash that were dumped every mile or two on the sides of the road. I usually began to appreciate Cairo's aesthetic within a few days of my return. Instead of being agonized by the constant honking, I would enjoy the shabby music blasting from the speakers of different cars, and maybe even clap along to the tablas. Instead of being disturbed by the children who begged, the scars and zits and despair on their faces, I would notice the luckier children behind them, doing tricks with their bicycles on the sidewalks. Instead of fixating on the restrictions of religion, I would see just how profound it was that 5 times a day, every day, millions of people gathered to pray and meditate together. This, however, was far from a regular homecoming, and I feared I was at risk of losing whatever affection I had for my hometown. At a stoplight, a man with no legs dragged his torso through the spaces between the cars and asked me for change. I stuck my arm out the window and gave him a $5 bill. "You have to get it exchanged at the Sarafa," I said. "It's worth 30 pounds. He kissed it, tapped it on his forehead, and then looked up at God. There was no traffic on the 6th of October highway, an unusual occurrence that punched my chest with anxiety. We would be downtown in minutes, and I would have to withstand what could be weeks of family arguments, breakdowns, and mourning without being able to have a single drink. As we drove through the Zamalek, I thought of what would happen if Amir was identified by someone who knew him as my cousin. It would be one of the relevant topics of conversation for weeks to come. "Did you watch that game last night? Did you see that movie? Oh, you know that terrorist on the news, the one who shot up the train? Well, that's Shiro's cousin. What would it do to my reputation here in Cairo? Would people assume I came from a whole family of fanatics? Would any respectable man ever let me marry his daughter? I already came from an inferior lineage. My grandfather hadn't been a Besha with European blood. He had been a businessman, but a peasant too. He had never learned how to eat with a fork and knife and could speak only one language. Now, my cousin had become a terrorist, a murderer, And not only would people claim to know someone who knew him, but my high school friends would remember meeting him the day my mother forced me to take him out on his birthday. And I'll stop right there.
Thank you for that reading, and congratulations again on the book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you, all of you, for tuning in tonight, and for those tuning in from the live stream. Once again, if you haven't picked up or purchased your copy, please do so, and you can pick up additional copies at the front desk where you came in, or in the link in the description. And now the signing line will be taking place at that desk over there, so please wait to approach Doma until he settles in. But anyways, thanks so much, and take care, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for that. Those are great things. I think we have to put our masks on.
Oh yeah, Doma. I just got a hug.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was like, I want more reading.
I have more questions.
Yeah, it was hard to keep track of time.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Oh my god, I forgot this.
Emotional.
Yeah.